The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse slammed shut behind Brigadier General Harrison Reed as he strode inside. His polished black boots echoed off the marble floor, and his crisp uniform, decorated with decades of service, commanded silent respect. Today felt like any other until Officer Nolan Pierce stepped forward. Pierce had been posted at the metal detectors for months, eyeing every entrant with thinly veiled contempt. His decorated city police uniform couldn't hide the dark gleam of prejudice in his gaze. From the moment General Reed passed the checkpoint, Pierce's hand tightened on his holster. He planted himself directly in Reed's path boots, scraping the floor, and barked, "You need to stop right there." Reed barely glanced at him and continued toward the courtroom doors. He had testified here many times on military conduct, national security, even corruption, and saw no reason to yield. "I said stop." Pierce's voice cut through the murmurs in the hallway. Clerks and lawyers paused watching. Reed halted and turned slowly. His face remained calm, steady, and untroubled by the armed challenge. "I don't take orders from you, officer," he said evenly. "Step aside." Pierce's fingers twitched as he unclasped his holster. "Who the hell do you think you are, walking in here like you own the place?" he snapped. The tension coiled in the corridor. When Pierce finally drew his weapon, the click of metal echoed like a shot. "That's a loaded weapon you're reaching for," Officer Reed said quietly, his authority filling the space. Pierce froze, finger on the trigger, trembling with rage and blind prejudice. The hallway gasped. Clerks dropped files. Other officers reached for radios and weapons. But none reacted as swiftly as Pierce, the gun barrel, swung toward Reed, a man who had led soldiers through war zones, advised presidents, and risked his life for his country. Reed did not flinch. He had faced far worse bullets, mortar fire, the chaos of combat. Instead, he took a measured step forward. Pierce's nostrils flared. His knuckles whitened on the grip. "I said stop," he bellowed, voice cracking. Reed's voice was ice. "Do you intend to shoot an unarmed general in a courthouse?" he asked. The weapon wavered. In that moment, Reed's unyielding calm met Pierce's fear and fury, and everything hung on the officer's next decision. "Do you know what you're doing?" "Officer Pierce," General Reed's voice cut through the silence. The hallway fell deadly quiet, witnesses frozen, even Pierce's fellow officers at the metal detectors were unsure whether to intervene. "Don't take another step," Pierce growled, though doubt had crept into his tone. Reed remained motionless, hands at his sides, posture unwavering. "You have a split second to decide," he said calmly. "Do you really want to be the man who shot an army chief in a courthouse?" Pierce's breath caught. Reed saw the flicker of realization in his eyes, buried beneath years of unchecked arrogance. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. Judge Caroline Preston, steely and authoritative, stepped out, flanked by two bailiffs. "What on earth is happening here?" she demanded, taking in Pierce's raised gun and Reed's composed stance. The courthouse held its breath. Pierce shifted his weight, the weapon twitching forward, his final fatal mistake. An officer nearby shouted, "Every unit secure the aisle." In an instant, Pierce's colleagues drew their sidearms, training them on him. "Drop the weapon," they commanded. Pierce's face went ashen. He lowered the gun, letting it clatter on the marble floor. The echo seemed to shatter the tension. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then two officers grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. With such strength, he stumbled forward, shock and disbelief twisting his expression. "I was just," Pierce stammered, voice cracking. "You're under arrest," one officer said coldly, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "Do you know who this man is?" Pierce spat, nodding toward Reed. "Do you know what I've done?" Judge Preston advanced, fury in her eyes. "Officer Pierce, you drew your weapon on a decorated U.S. Army chief inside a courthouse. There is no excuse. This is not a joke." Pierce's protest died in his throat as the bailiffs escorted him away. The hallway, once charged with tension, remained silent until the courtroom doors swung closed behind him. "Insane, you can't do this." "I was just doing my job," Pierce snarled as officers hauled him toward the back exit, his protests fading down the marble corridor. One of the officers snapped back, "Your job doesn't include attempted murder." Reed watched in silence, dignity intact, as Pierce disappeared from view. The courthouse buzzed with shock whispers, shaking heads, and stunned stares fixed on Reed, a mixture of respect and disbelief in every eye. Judge Preston turned to him. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Reed nodded. "I've had worse," he replied. Her stern expression softened only slightly. I'm sorry. You had to endure that, she said, rubbing her temples. I promise you that man will never wear a badge again. Reed's gaze followed the direction of Pierce's removal. You might be right, Your Honor, he said softly, but this isn't over. And he was right. Within hours, the nation would learn what had happened here, and Nolan Pierce's real reckoning was just beginning. When Reed re-entered the courtroom, murmurs still drifted in the air. Lawyers, reporters, and spectators glanced toward the heavy doors where Pierce had been dragged off. Yet General Reed walked forward with his usual measured stride. The trial before him was not his own, but that of a defense contractor accused of war profiteering, siphoning funds meant for soldiers into private accounts. As Judge Preston cleared her throat, offering a perfunctory apology for the earlier disruption, the first question was about to be asked when the doors burst open once more. Every head turned, half expecting Pierce to storm back in. Instead, a breathless officer appeared and hurried to the bench, leaning close to the judge. Her face darkened, and she pounded the gavel lightly. We will take a brief recess, she announced. Then turning to Reed, she added, You might want to hear this. Reed frowned but remained seated. The officer stepped into view. Officer Nolan Pierce has been officially charged, he declared. The district attorney is filing attempted murder charges. A stunned silence fell over the room. Pierce, the same man who had harassed dozens of black citizens, had crossed the final line. Reed's jaw tightened. This was not merely a scandal. It was the moment a system was forced to reckon with its own failure. Curled hands rested on his uniform as he prepared to resume his testimony, knowing the courthouse and the country would never be the same. Inside a building meant for justice, he now faced real consequences for the first time in his life. But would this be the end or only the beginning? The courtroom emptied into the hallways where reporters had already gathered like vultures, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Reed ignored the chaos, walking with his usual measured pace, his mind elsewhere. He had seen injustice before, men abusing power, corrupting systems, hiding behind badges, but never one brought down so swiftly. Nolan Pierce was arrested, yet Reed knew this was only the opening salvo. At the corridor's end, an assistant district attorney approached Cassandra Miles, lead prosecutor on Pierce's case. She was a middle-aged black woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. General Reed, she said, offering her hand, thank you for acting quickly. Reed shook her hand firmly. This is already national news. Miles continued, rubbing her temple, and we have an airtight case, but it won't be easy. Pierce will claim he thought you were a threat, that he acted on instinct. Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. Instinct, Miles shrugged. It's the same instinct that turns innocent men into suspects, she lowered her voice. We need your testimony, not just about what happened, but why it happened. Reed nodded, steeling himself. I'll testify. Miles's nod held no joy, only resolve. Good, we'll make sure Pierce never wears a badge or a uniform again. Legal experts have analyzed the network, and military officials have condemned it. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was overflowing. Every bench occupied rows of reporters at the back, scribbling notes and whispering into cameras. But none of that distracted General Reed as he took the witness stand. This wasn't about headlines. It was about speaking the truth. Prosecutor Cassandra Miles approached the podium, eyes sharp and steady. General Reed, please describe what happened that day. Reed sat upright in the witness chair, posture unshaken. I entered the courthouse to testify in a different case. I walked past security exactly as I had many times before. Officer Pierce called out to me demanding I stop. When I didn't immediately comply, he reached for his firearm. Miles nodded. Did you threaten him or raise your voice? No, Reed replied. I made no aggressive movements. And when Officer Pierce pulled his weapon on you, how did you respond? I asked if he understood what he was doing. Reed set his gaze steady. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as jurors absorbed his words. Miles continued, Did Officer Pierce see you as a decorated officer? Reed exhaled slowly. No, he saw me as a black man who wouldn't obey his orders. A heavy silence fell. Pierce's lawyer rose for cross-examination. General, you're a tall, broad-shouldered man. Could you have appeared intimidating? That depends on who you ask, Reed replied calmly. And you didn't comply when Officer Pierce ordered you to stop. I would never have asked a white man in uniform to stop, Reed said quietly. I watched 3 white men enter that courthouse without being challenged. None of them had a gun pointed at them. The courtroom buzzed as his words hung in the air, and the defense attorney, unsettled, had nothing more to ask. General Reed stepped down from the witness stand, the trial not yet over, but the atmosphere irrevocably changed. Officer Pierce was no longer merely a man who had made a mistake. He had been exposed. With each passing day, his downfall seemed inevitable. The weight of truth hung over the courtroom like a gathering storm. The defense had no real argument, no justification for Nolan Pierce's actions. The evidence, witness, testimony, surveillance videos, and most damningly, Pierce's own arrogance left them with nothing. Still, Pierce sat at the defense table, spine rigid, fingers digging into the edge, as if he could somehow halt the unfolding verdict. His lawyer avoided his gaze, unable to offer solace. Then came the prosecution's closing argument. Cassandra Miles rose, face composed, and addressed the jury. Officer Nolan Pierce did not hesitate that day. He did not ask questions. He did not assess the situation. He reached for his weapon and pointed it at an innocent man, because in his mind that man had already committed a crime. She gestured toward Reed, seated calmly in the front row. A black man wearing the uniform of a decorated Army chief walking into a courthouse, that was enough to compel Officer Pierce to draw his gun in broad daylight in a place of law and order before dozens of witnesses. He did not see a war hero. He saw a threat. Her voice sharpened, slicing through the courtroom silence. This was not fear. This was not self-defense. This was power unchecked. An officer who believed his badge granted him the authority to judge who belonged and who did not. When his authority was questioned, when a black man did not cower, did not bow, did not stop, he pulled his weapon. She paused, letting her words settle over the jurors, their expressions shifting from unease to resolution. Imagine if General Reed had not been who he was. What if this had happened on an empty street with no witnesses, no cameras? The courtroom held its breath. We all know the answer. With that, she returned to her seat. The judge gave final instructions, and the jury retired. Only 3 hours later, they returned. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp ran through the courtroom. On aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. Pierce's body jerked as if struck. On reckless endangerment, guilty. Reporters erupted into murmurs, scrambling for notes. Yet Reed remained still, eyes fixed on the man who had dared to aim a gun at him. When order was restored, the judge spoke again. Officer Nolan Pierce, you have betrayed the trust placed in you as an officer of the law. Your actions were reckless, prejudiced, and endangered those you swore to protect. There is no excuse, no justification. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison. The judge's words echoed life without the possibility of parole. They struck Pierce like a hammer. His mouth fell open, but no sound came. It was over. The authority he had wielded to intimidate others had now been used to strip him of everything. He was no longer a police officer. He was an inmate. As the bailiffs moved in to escort him away, the only sound in the courtroom was General Harrison Reed's calm, deliberate voice. Justice. One word, but enough. Pierce was hauled to his feet. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as his proud, arrogant posture crumpled beneath the weight of his conviction. His face, once twisted with defiance, was now frozen in disbelief. He jerked against the officers, holding his arms as if to exert some final shred of power, but there was none left. His badge was gone, his uniform was gone, his freedom was gone. He had spent years believing his position made him untouchable. His authority as a police officer gave him the right to decide who was a threat, and his gun gave him the power to enforce that belief. The world had watched him make the wrong choice, and now the system he had once abused buried him beneath its judgment. General Reed remained standing, eyes following Pierce as he was led from the courtroom. The irony was bitter in how swiftly the power had shifted, how the man who had aimed a weapon at him was now bound. Reed turned and stepped past rows of spectators and reporters furiously taking notes past faces that had witnessed what true justice looked like. Outside, the cold air hit him, but he barely noticed. Cassandra Miles joined him on the courthouse steps, arms crossed. That was satisfying, she said, exhaling sharply. Not many cases like this end so decisively. Reed nodded but remained silent. He had fought enough battles to know that Harrison Y seldom felt as sweet as people expected. Miles studied his expression. Something on your mind, she asked. There's another Pierce out there, he replied quietly. Miles followed his gaze. Yeah, she admitted, probably more than one. Reed let his breath show in the cold air. Today we took one down, he said, But the problem isn't just one man. No. Miles agreed, but it's a start. Reed nodded slowly. For too long, men like Pierce had pulled weapons without consequence, used badges like shields, and racism like unwritten law. But this time the story had ended differently. A badge had not protected a guilty man, and a gun had not silenced an innocent one. As Reed descended the courthouse steps, the weight of the trial and the confrontation settled in his chest. He wasn't naive enough to think it was over, but he wasn't cynical enough to think it didn't matter. Change happened in moments, and today was one of them. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the world watched. For the first time in a long time, justice had spoken louder than a gun. A few months later, the courthouse steps had become a symbol of accountability. A new training program for law enforcement rolled out statewide, mandating de-escalation tactics and implicit bias workshops, an initiative spearheaded by a bipartisan coalition moved by the Pierce trial. Sergeant Cole's unit hosted seminars where General Reed himself spoke, recounting how restraint and respect for every citizen's dignity are as vital as any badge or weapon. Meanwhile, Cassandra Miles' reputation soared. She was tapped to chair a statewide commission on police reform, ensuring that evidence of misconduct could no longer be buried behind department walls. Inside the penitentiary, Pierce struggled with the weight of his choices. The once confident officer endured his first winter behind bars, haunted not by inmate threats, but by memories of the courtroom's stunned silence and Reed's unwavering calm. A handful of his former colleagues quietly resigned rather than face the new oversight board's scrutiny, and recruitment screens began flagging applicants with histories of racial profiling complaints. Across town, Dr. Harrington's emergency ward displayed a plaque honoring the veterans and patients' first protocol. No uniform, no skin tone could ever justify a drawn weapon again. Justice, as one local editorial put it, had rippled outward from one courtroom and touched every corner of the system. This story shows us the danger of prejudice when it becomes power and the strength of a voice daring to challenge wrongdoing. The protagonist's calm and steadfast response not only saved him from injustice, but set a new standard for citizens do not remain silent in the face of abuse. The message here is that power must be overseen by conscience and responsibility, and each individual can become a gatekeeper of justice. Now it's your turn to speak. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that abuses of power like these are still widespread? Share your personal perspective below. When do you predict society will truly overcome racial prejudice? Comment the year you believe, 2030, 2040, or 2050. Every opinion helps illuminate our shared goal, a fair society with no room for racism. Don't forget to click subscribe so you won't miss more powerful stories, and to continue standing together in the fight for justice. Each subscription, each comment is a step forward in the battle against prejudice, moving us all toward a better future. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional. All characters and events are creations of the author and are not intended to reference or criticize any real person. It is designed to raise awareness of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating one another with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose all forms of violence, prejudice, and injustice. Please consider this before viewing.